opposites and balance. But this is your main phoenix. The phoenix is said to have lived its life and done all of its work and things in Arabia, but when its time comes to die, it goes back to Egypt, if you remember the home of alchemy, where it goes up in a cloud of flames, and there's a baby that's just kind of comes out of the ashes somewhere. And that brings us to an interesting point about the phoenix. Quite often you see gorgeous phoenixes that are like peacocks, really gorgeous golden and green and blue things. But whilst I was doing the work for this talk, it became apparent that most phoenixes look like this, kind of small, scraggy and surprised, which I guess given the way they're born isn't entirely, shocking. So that's the phoenix, rebirth through fire. Remember, a lot of things that the alchemist did was to do with the gentle heating of stuff, to turn it into something else, because it's thought that that's one of the ways that our organic chemistry arose, was just through gentle heating. So fire was important to them, fire as a means of transformation. And of course, we have a lot of metaphors for that, don't we? A rebirth through fire, a baptism of fire. All of these things are kind of like alchemical metaphors that have been carried through to us. Another couple of symbols that we're fairly familiar with. We've had the Ouroboros, here's some more serpents. We've got the rod of Asclepius. Asclepius was one of these guys who was a really, really famous healer in the past from Greece. He's one of those guys who was so good at healing people he could bring guys back from the dead, which is another favourite scheme or metaphor of the alchemist. Not only the extension of life, but bringing people back from the dead, the resolution or the return of a soul into another body. All of these things are associated with Asclepius. It's a single snake up a staff, and for reasons, I guess, historical reasons for me, it always reminds me of the staff of Aaron in the Bible. You remember it's described as a staff with a copper serpent, one copper serpent. And although you could do lots of healing work was done with Aaron's rod, what it's most famous for, of course, is spreading the plagues through Egypt, the plagues of blood and toads and all the rest. Now, eventually the rod of Asclepius over time was kind of replaced by the rod of Caduceus. And those of you who've seen my sacred geometry talk will know that one of the key things I talk about is the misappropriation of sacred symbols. And this is certainly a symbol which has not only been misappropriated, but then it's been reappropriated and misappropriated again in time. The current orthodox history of this symbol is that it first arose in Sumer, the ancient land of Shinar, which I talk about a bit more in the history talk. And that when it arose, it was a symbol for buying and selling. But as a result over time of it being associated with alchemy and with the Kabbalah and with other mystical schools, astronomy it was associated with, it slowly but surely became associated with healing. I find it absolutely fascinating that an ancient symbol for commerce and trade became in the 20th century a symbol for healing and was worn by all of our National Health Service people, and it was on the side of all the ambulances. Now, it really got taken on as a medical symbol when it was taken on board by the American Navy at the turn of the 20th century, about in the first decade of the 1900s. And then around... Sorry?
Sorry, I thought it was an Illuminati.
Well, they've taken it on as well.
Yeah.
Actually, when we get to it, it was taken on then in the 1940s by the Army, the US Army as well. So they took it on as their medical course, so it became embedded. But the point of it being an Illuminati thing, I think, refers back to dragon courts and other stuff that's come to us from a long, long time ago. And that is the symbol which is these crossing points of our 7 chakras, and the crown chakra is at the top, which is the one that we're reaching to cross. And also it's said to be an ancient memory and a shamanic memory of the shape of DNA. One way or the other, what's really interesting now is that if you look at your ambulances and your paramedics, they're going back to wearing this. Has everybody noticed that we're moving back to the staff of Asclepius? So we're kind of moving away from a symbol for buying and selling and trade back to a symbol of legendary and mythical healing, which I take as a genuinely good sign. I mean, at the same time, we see the National Health Service being forced to take on chiropractic and acupuncture. There's no way it would be doing that unless there was a lot of people absolutely making it do it. And I think that the return of this old symbol is probably ultimately a good sign. Other major symbols, we've got 2 triangles, one pointing down and one pointing up, water and fire. There's a lot of opposites in here, which are quite important. People know they don't want to get me started on triangles. I could do another half hour. I could certainly do a lot of time about the kind of the upward pointing sort of mother of form reaching up just like all of the plants and everything does. As the sun just comes up in the morning, things start to unfurl and reach up to kind of Father Son. Father Son himself, of course, is data. It's raw data coming down, giving us information, feeding ourselves. We ourselves give off light. So you've got the Father of consciousness coming down and the Mother of form reaching up. And of course, when they actually match each other perfectly, you get Solomon's seal. That is the creation of a new and complex unity from the synthesis of opposites. So those symbols are really complex, really beautiful things. They're simple things to look at, but their entire mythos is hung off them by the alchemists. Mercury and sulphur. It's fairly clear why the alchemists were so interested in mercury, because they were interested in the transmutation of elements, the changing of one thing into another, the unfolding of things as they grew. And they believed that things kind of moved from the dull to the shiny, if you like. Mercury, I think they chose because it's a metal and it runs around on glass. That's the kind of thing that is naturally of interest to alchemists. I'm not quite sure why they chose sulphur. I'm sure something will turn up eventually which will tell me. But they believe that all things come about as a result of the interaction in the belly of the earth of mercury and sulphur. And that one thing sort of leads to another, which sort of leads to another. Now, that might have seemed like a really crazy idea 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, but we now know how elements are born in the heart of stars. We understand that hydrogen has only got one proton in its core and one electron on the outside, that helium's got 2 protons in its nucleus and 2 electrons in its core, in its cage by and large, that beryllium, or was it lithium's got 3. So, and that those 3 things are kind of how everything started. There was hydrogen and helium and a tiny, tiny bit of 1 or 2 other things. And apparently those elements have to get sucked into the heart of stars, where they get burnt and burnt away and loads of things happen. Millions of things are created and destroyed, but the overall result is a small bunch of elements that have got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 protons in their nucleus, and they're the ones that we're made of. The nitrogen, the helium, the carbon, the oxygen, all of those things come from first generation stars. And then those themselves get blown into space, and they hang around for a while until something knocks them all together into a 3rd generation star. And then you start seeing the heavier elements coming out. So in a way, they were right. It all starts with, not with hydrogen, not with mercury and sulphur, but with hydrogen and helium. But does everybody understand that they have the right kind of idea, that stuff sort of stacks up? We'll talk about it later. The sun and the moon, they celebrated all sorts of opposites. We see the marriage of the sun and the moon a lot in alchemical literature. And really what it's a representation of is often light and darkness, the masculine and the feminine, the outer and the inner. There's always an emphasis on opposites, especially on male and female, and the volatile and the fixed. They had this idea of kind of proportion and dimension. But they also understood that over time, transformation would lead to this volatile, changeable thing becoming fixed. And the thing that appears really fixed, eventually over time would become volatile. So they understood that there would be a complete transformation of things. Has anybody heard the old riddle about what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The answer being that the unstoppable force stops and the immovable object moves. So what happens is you've had this state of being for all this time when these rules appear to be true. That thing's never going to move, and there's nothing in the world that can make it move. And then just suddenly your entire paradigm changes. All the rules that applied before that occurred don't apply anymore. And that's the kind of thing that the alchemists were reaching for, a sort of paradigm shift. Paracelsus eventually decided to add a 3rd element to the mercury and the sulphur, and this is where he started getting himself into trouble with the church. He connected mercury with spirit and sulphur with the soul, which is probably some clue as to a lot of the complexity that the alchemists attached to these 2 elements, as it were. He added the body at the peak of the pyramid and salt. And what got him into trouble was the fact that he said that the body is the pinnacle of the manifestation of your spiritual entity. That this is where your spirit has got you so far. This is the best thing there is. And that spirit and soul was somehow secondary to that. Now obviously the church was going, your body is shit. Your body is sinful, your body is a crime, and what you're reaching for is your spirit and your soul and where you're going to after here. Paracelsus was saying we're much more important than that. This is what it's all about. He was obviously quite a cocky character because Celsus was a bit of an Asclepius character. Celsus was known, at least to orthodoxy, as the greatest medic of all time. You know, he's the one that had actually brought it all off. Paracelsus means greater than Celsus. So we can see that he had no small opinion of himself. His real name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hockenheim. You can tell from this that he was an aristocrat.
Yeah.
He was, which is where he got all his money from. His middle name, Bombastus, was said to be the root of the word bombastic, which, given that he called himself Paracelsus, you know, greater than Celsus, seems like a reasonable argument. I don't think it's quite true. It's something to do with stuffing silk moths, I think, actually. Anyway, whatever, he's said to be the father of sort of holistic medicine, in as far as he was the first one to believe, if you like, in treating the whole person. He was a great believer in the power of the mind, and he also believed that there was undeniable truth in the mutual nature of the worlds above and below. He was, his idea that you could also change the inner state of an entity by putting stuff from outside into it, i.e. medicine, I think gives him a fair claim to being the father of allopathic medicine as well. Whatever, not only was he unpopular with the church, he was also really unpopular with his fellow nobles, because he used to treat the poor for free, but he used to really screw the notes out of anybody he treated in the aristocracy. Paracelsus. Oh yes. There we see one of the symbols, one of the pictures that got the alchemists such a bad rep. They seem to be quite good at keeping themselves unpopular. It's got kind of, you've got a really wild looking bloke with a massive beard. He's got wings, the wings of Mercury on his ankles. His body's got kind of dragon-like and serpent-like qualities, so both sorts of Ouroboros, if you like. He's got signs for the sun and the moon and Mercury over his head. I've got no idea what it means.